The story begins with a haunting question that lingers in the air. How does a man who once stood at the very forefront of a movement, a man who should be a household name in American history, fade so completely into obscurity? The opening sequence sets the tone, a slow, deliberate pan across abandoned archives, empty rooms, and dusty, forgotten bookshelves. Amidst this decay, there is a sense of something lost, something valuable, but no longer present. The silence is palpable. Then, the voice of an academic, soft but firm, begins reading a passage from Clotel, William Wells Brown's groundbreaking 1847 novel. The words seem to echo, reverberating through the stillness, as if calling out from another time. The voice, calm yet urgent, speaks of love, betrayal, and escape. The words are powerful, revolutionary even. Yet, few remember the name behind them today. Cut to an empty Mississippi landscape. The lush greenery of the land is juxtaposed with the stillness of the present day. An atmosphere of melancholy and mystery begins to build. This is the place where William Wells Brown once lived, worked, and fought for freedom, yet today, it feels almost forgotten by time. How did a man who had once been a beacon for black liberation in America vanish from the history books? How did a figure so pivotal to the fight against slavery, to the very foundation of the American literary canon, fade into nothingness? As the voice recedes, leaving only the lingering echoes of the words, the camera zooms in on an old, yellow document, a faded letter, possibly from Brown himself. It is a fragment of history, and yet it feels like a piece of a larger puzzle that we are only just beginning to understand. The document's edges are frayed, as if time itself is erasing it from existence. This powerful visual conveys that Brown, like these forgotten pieces of paper, is being slowly erased from history. The camera pulls back, revealing a collection of dusty books on a shelf in a neglected library. A book titled The Life and Adventures of William Wells Brown rests on the top of the pile, its cover worn and faded. The title seems to hold a promise, but the book itself is practically forgotten by anyone who passes through this abandoned space. There is an eerie sense of lost potential. How did this happen? How did the man who published the first novel by a black American, a groundbreaking work that would challenge the status quo of both literature and society, disappear from public consciousness? The silence is broken as the screen fades to black. The scene shifts to the stark, cold reality of history. Facts, dates, and names that once filled pages of textbooks now seem distant and lifeless. The camera focuses on an academic working late into the night in a dimly lit room, surrounded by piles of research. Their eyes are tired, their hands weary, yet their determination is unshaken. They flip through pages of obscure historical records and find fragments, scattered mentions of William Wells Brown. The name is rarely in the spotlight, but when it is mentioned, it is often overshadowed by other figures of the time. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe. These are the names that dominate the narrative, and yet Brown was, in many ways, just as instrumental in shaping the intellectual and literary landscape of his time. But somehow, he has been relegated to the margins. We hear the voice of the narrator, now more direct, reflecting on the irony of Brown's erasure. He was a voice for the voiceless, the narrator says, as images of the southern landscape, once filled with the echoes of slave labor, are shown. A man who wrote not just about freedom, but about the very soul of the nation. The camera lingers on an old photograph of Brown, his serious expression, his penetrating eyes that seem to look beyond the camera, beyond history itself. The image is striking. And yet, for many, this is the only image that remains. As the voice continues, we delve deeper into the mystery. Who was William Wells Brown, really? And why has he been pushed so far into the shadows of American history? The viewer is left to wonder, what is the price of silence? What is the cost of forgetting? The camera cuts again, this time to a quiet, dimly lit study, filled with books and papers scattered across an old wooden desk. It's as if Brown himself were still here, working late into the night, his pen scratching out the words that would one day become Clotel. In the corner of the room, a piece of furniture, old and creaking, shifts ever so slightly, giving the sense that Brown's presence still lingers in these forgotten spaces. His ideas, his words, his legacy, these are the things that have been buried under time and indifference. The narration grows more somber, hinting that the story we are about to unravel is one of profound significance. It is not just the story of a man, but the story of a people, a nation, and a history that has been obscured for far too long. William Wells Brown's legacy was not just erased by the passage of time, but by the very systems of power that sought to suppress the voices of the oppressed. This is a tale of triumph and tragedy, of resistance and erasure, of a man who rose above the darkest of circumstances only to be pushed back into the shadows by those who feared his message. As the screen fades to black once again, the sound of a quill scratching on paper fills the silence, followed by the soft whisper of a turning page. The camera zooms out, revealing a worn book, a lone survivor of time's cruel erasure. It is Clotel. This is the story of a legacy lost and rediscovered, a tale of how history tries to forget but is incapable of fully silencing the voices of the past. With this final thought, the screen transitions to the next chapter, and the journey to uncover William Wells Brown's legacy truly begins. The mystery is only starting to unfold, and the questions of why and how his name was erased from history will follow the viewer through each unfolding chapter of his life and work. William Wells Brown's story begins not in the pages of a novel or in the speeches of an abolitionist, but in the dark, painful heart of America's system of slavery. Born in 1814 in Kentucky, Brown's earliest years were marked by the brutal realities of the institution that would shape every aspect of his life. His mother, Elizabeth, was enslaved, and his father, a wealthy white plantation owner, was absent, his identity obscured by the veil of secrecy and shame that surrounded the lives of mixed-race children born into slavery. Brown's birth itself was a product of this violence, and his early years were filled with the rawest forms of human suffering. His first memory of life would be one of separation. At the age of 10, Brown was sold away from his mother. This separation, a violent ripping of familial bonds, would remain one of the most emotionally shattering experiences of his life. It wasn't just the loss of his mother, but the loss of the only stable anchor in his world, a constant presence in an environment built on exploitation and dehumanization. For years, he would feel the absence of that maternal connection, that sense of security that no amount of physical strength could replace. As a child, Brown was moved from one plantation to the next, each new place representing a new set of owners, new conditions of labor, new forms of cruelty. The grueling work in the fields, the constant threat of physical punishment, and the ever-present specter of being sold away again, all of these became part of his daily existence. Brown's early life was consumed by the very system that sought to destroy his humanity, to strip away every vestige of his identity and spirit. Yet, even as he was subjected to this brutal treatment, there was something within him, something that refused to be extinguished. It was a will to survive, to fight against the tide of hopelessness that surrounded him. In his teenage years, Brown's awareness began to sharpen. He was not just a passive victim of the system, he was keenly aware of the deep injustices surrounding him. He witnessed the suffering of his fellow enslaved people, the broken families, the psychological toll of constant degradation. He also began to realize the power of knowledge. Education, for a slave, was a dangerous thing, a tool of resistance that could challenge the very foundations of the system that kept him in chains. Though it was illegal in many places for slaves to learn how to read and write, Brown found ways to educate himself. He would secretly borrow books from others, hiding them from the prying eyes of his masters, absorbing every bit of knowledge he could. His desire for freedom grew stronger with each passing day. Brown saw, more clearly than ever, the vast chasm that separated the lives of enslaved black people from the so-called free people of the North. He knew that the only way to escape the cruelty of slavery was through escape itself. But escaping was no simple task. It was fraught with danger, a constant game of cat and mouse with those who would hunt him down and return him to bondage. For Brown, the decision to escape was one that carried the weight of years of suffering, but also the weight of immense hope. In 1834, at the age of 20, Brown made his break. With nothing but his wits and a fierce desire for freedom, he escaped from Kentucky, fleeing northward with the help of the Underground Railroad. His journey was perilous, and the risks were great. Yet, in those dark moments, as he trudged through snow-covered fields or hidden barns, there was an incredible sense of possibility that fueled his every step. He knew that the world beyond slavery was one filled with untold opportunities, one in which he could be his own man. He was determined to reach it. The harrowing escape took him through Ohio, where he found a brief respite before continuing on his journey. Brown eventually made it to the relative safety of Boston, Massachusetts, a city that was a hotbed of abolitionist activity. It was here that his new life truly began. In Boston, Brown was introduced to the world of abolitionism, a movement that sought not only to end slavery but to fundamentally challenge the social and racial structures that upheld it. He became involved with abolitionist organizations, where he met and befriended many prominent figures in the movement, including Frederick Douglass. Though he had escaped the literal chains of slavery, Brown's battle was far from over. The mental scars of his time in bondage remained with him, haunting him as he navigated this new world of freedom. He was free in body but not yet fully in mind. The psychological weight of his former life in Kentucky was heavy. He had been broken by the system that enslaved him, and now he had to find a way to rebuild himself. The journey from being a broken, enslaved man to becoming a free and autonomous individual was no easy feat, but, as he began to explore his new life in the North, he found a path forward that would define his future: writing. It was in Boston that Brown's intellectual awakening began. He began to write letters, essays, and speeches, speaking out against the horrors of slavery and for the cause of emancipation. His eloquence, his first-hand knowledge of the cruelties of slavery, and his ability to communicate these truths with conviction made him a rising star in the abolitionist movement. But it was not just his words that made him powerful, it was his lived experience. He had been there. He had felt the lash of the whip, seen the broken families, and lived in the constant terror of being torn from his loved ones. These were not abstract concepts to him. They were realities, lived realities that he shared with his audiences. Soon, Brown's works began to reach a wider audience. He published his first book, Narrative of William Wells Brown, in 1847, in which he detailed his life as a slave and his escape to freedom. This work was groundbreaking, an intimate, personal account that gave voice to the experiences of slaves in a way that had never been done before. It was not just a story of escape, it was a story of survival, of resilience, and of the unbreakable human spirit. But Brown's literary success was just the beginning. His desire to continue the fight for freedom took him deeper into the world of activism, and he soon began writing the novel Clotel, which would become the first novel published by an African American. Clotel was not just a work of fiction, it was a bold, defiant statement against the institution of slavery. It exposed the realities of mixed-race families, the horrors of forced breeding, and the oppressive power of white supremacy. The novel would go on to become a significant work in American literature, although, as we will soon see, it would not be the last time Brown's name would be erased from history. Yet, in this moment, in the early years of his freedom, there was a sense of optimism in Brown's life. He had escaped the chains of slavery, but more than that, he had found a new voice, one that resonated with the struggles of millions, one that would echo throughout history. But as we will soon discover, the fight for freedom and recognition is not an easy one, and Brown's journey, though triumphant in many ways, would not be free of setbacks. His path to truly achieving his place in history would be fraught with challenges, as forces both within and outside his own community sought to erase him from the pages of time. As William Wells Brown settled into his newfound life in Boston, he was surrounded by a rapidly changing intellectual landscape. The city was alive with abolitionist activity, and it was here that Brown's literary ambitions began to take root. Despite the hardships of his past, he was now free to explore his intellectual potential, and he found an avenue for his thoughts and experiences through writing. It was a form of liberation unlike any other, one that allowed him not only to express himself but also to speak for the voiceless, to give voice to the millions who suffered under the yoke of slavery. Brown's journey into the world of writing was born out of necessity, driven by his overwhelming desire to share his story and the stories of those who had suffered with him. The written word became his weapon, his shield against the injustices he had endured. Writing was not just an act of personal expression, but a form of resistance, a way to fight back against the systematic erasure of black voices and experiences in American society. His first major work, Narrative of William Wells Brown, was a deeply personal account of his life as an enslaved person and his eventual escape to freedom. In this work, he laid bare the horrors of slavery, the brutality, the constant threat of violence, the dehumanization, and the loss of family. The narrative was raw and honest, written with a sharp clarity that conveyed not just the external suffering, but the psychological toll slavery had on those subjected to it. The impact of his narrative was immediate. The book became an important part of the abolitionist literature of the time, offering a first-hand account of the realities of slavery in a way that was both intimate and harrowing. Brown's voice, once stifled and suppressed, was now being heard across the United States and beyond. His experience was no longer just a personal story, it became part of a larger, collective struggle against slavery, resonating with abolitionists and free blacks alike who sought to expose the evils of the system. The narrative served as both a testimony of survival and a call to action, urging others to join the fight for freedom and equality. However, the true depth of Brown's literary awakening came with his next major work, Clotel, or The President's Daughter, a novel that would go on to be recognized as the first novel written by an African American. Clotel was a bold and groundbreaking piece of literature. It was not just a work of fiction, it was a social critique, a scathing commentary on the institution of slavery, and an exploration of the intersection of race, identity, and power in America. The novel tells the story of Clotel, the daughter of Thomas Jefferson and an enslaved woman, highlighting the tragic consequences of racial mixing and the complex, often contradictory nature of American society's relationship with race. Through the character of Clotel, Brown addressed the often hidden and painful truth about the mixed-race children of slave owners, who were treated as property despite their status as the biological children of powerful white men. These children were caught in an agonizing limbo, neither fully accepted by white society nor allowed the dignity of their black heritage. Clotel explored the psychological and emotional toll of this racial limbo, depicting the ways in which enslaved women were exploited and the often cruel fates they faced. The novel's portrayal of mixed-race relationships and the exploitation of black women was daring for its time, and it challenged the dominant narrative that sought to deny these stories or bury them under layers of shame and silence. Brown's writing was not merely academic, it was visceral, reflecting the lived experiences of enslaved people in a way that was both personal and universal. The novel's themes of racial injustice, the dehumanization of black bodies, and the arbitrary power of slaveholders resonated with readers who were beginning to understand the true horrors of slavery. Brown's portrayal of the anguish and suffering endured by Clotel and other characters was striking in its emotional depth, capturing the sense of despair and hopelessness that many enslaved individuals must have felt. Yet, even in the darkest moments, Brown's writing contained a thread of resistance, a belief that through awareness and action, the system could be dismantled. While Clotel was groundbreaking in its content, it also marked a turning point in Brown's development as a writer and public figure. The novel cemented his place as an important voice in the abolitionist movement, and its success provided him with the platform to speak more widely about the issue of slavery. It also drew attention to the contradictions inherent in American society. Brown's choice to center the story of a woman who was the product of a union between a white man and a black woman was a direct challenge to the prevailing racial hierarchies of the time. It forced readers to confront the uncomfortable truth that the very men who claimed ownership over black people were often the same men who fathered their children, further complicating the moral and ethical justifications for slavery. In the years following the publication of Clotel, Brown continued to write and speak out against slavery. He became a prominent figure in the abolitionist movement, delivering lectures across the North and becoming a well-known voice for the oppressed. His writings not only chronicled his own journey but also painted a broader picture of the plight of enslaved people in the United States. He wrote about the brutality of slave auctions, the crushing weight of constant labor, and the heartbreak of family separations. Through his work, Brown made it clear that slavery was not just an institution, it was a system built on the exploitation of human beings, and it was the responsibility of all Americans to challenge it. However, as Brown's influence grew, so did the resistance to his ideas. The more he wrote, the more he was labeled a radical, an agitator. His work was seen as a threat to the established order, and those who sought to maintain the institution of slavery began to push back. His books were banned in many southern states, and he faced growing opposition from pro-slavery advocates who attempted to discredit him and his work. Despite this, Brown remained resolute. His belief in the power of the written word, in its ability to educate and inspire, never wavered. But even as Brown's literary career flourished, there was a darker undercurrent to his success. As his work gained prominence, he began to encounter the limits of what his writing could accomplish. Despite the widespread admiration of his work among abolitionists and Northern intellectuals, his name was often overshadowed by other, more prominent figures in the movement. He was, in many ways, relegated to the margins of the very movement he helped to shape. Though his writings were celebrated, they did not achieve the same level of mainstream recognition as those of figures like Frederick Douglass or Harriet Beecher Stowe. As Brown's literary legacy grew, so too did the realization that the struggle for recognition, both as an artist and as a historical figure, was far from over. His works would be remembered by those who valued them, but they would not be immediately embraced by the wider public. In the years to come, Brown's name would slowly fade from the collective memory of American history, even as his contributions to literature and the abolitionist movement remained profound. Yet, in this moment, as he stood at the height of his literary and intellectual powers, Brown's voice was unmistakable. He had found a way to channel his pain, his anger, and his hope into a form that could not be easily silenced. His writing, particularly Clotel, was not just an act of personal catharsis, it was a revolutionary act, a defiant assertion of the humanity of black people in a world that sought to deny them that humanity. Brown had proven that the written word could be a tool of liberation, a tool capable of challenging the very foundations of the oppressive systems that sought to crush the spirits of those who were enslaved. And in doing so, he had begun to carve out a place for himself, not just as a man of history, but as a voice that would continue to resonate long after the pages of his books were turned. William Wells Brown's journey into abolitionism was not just a matter of personal advocacy, it was a commitment to a cause that defined not only his own freedom but the liberation of millions. After escaping slavery in 1834, Brown's life began to intertwine with the vibrant, dangerous world of the Underground Railroad. As the decades progressed, his involvement with abolitionist networks deepened, and he grew into one of the most vocal, influential figures in the movement. His fight for freedom transcended the personal, it became about dismantling the institution of slavery itself and fighting for the freedom and dignity of all enslaved people across the United States. In Boston, Brown found a community of like-minded individuals who were equally passionate about the cause of abolition. This network of abolitionists, many of whom were intellectuals, former slaves, and free black men and women, became the foundation upon which Brown would build his activism. But it was not just the intellectual discussions in salons or at abolitionist meetings that drew him in, it was the real, immediate action of resistance. Boston was not just an ideological hub for the abolition movement, it was a literal gateway to freedom for thousands of escaped slaves. The city's proximity to the Canadian border, where slavery was illegal, made it a key point on the Underground Railroad. Brown's work in abolitionism extended beyond writing and speaking. He became involved in helping other enslaved individuals escape to freedom. His first-hand knowledge of the escape routes, the dangers of slave catchers, and the covert methods used by abolitionists made him an invaluable member of the Underground Railroad network. As a person who had escaped slavery himself, he understood better than anyone the perilous journey ahead for those attempting to flee. His role in guiding others, offering them shelter, and providing them with crucial information was vital to the success of many escapes. Brown's experiences on the Underground Railroad were shaped by the tense atmosphere of the time. There was always the looming threat of discovery, of betrayal, and of violence, yet these risks were not enough to deter him. His determination to free as many people as possible outweighed any fear he might have had. As Brown became more involved in the abolitionist movement, he formed lasting bonds with some of the most prominent figures of the time. His friendships with individuals like Frederick Douglass, who would go on to become one of the most renowned voices in the abolitionist movement, were essential to shaping the broader direction of the fight for freedom. While Douglass's speeches and writings gained widespread recognition, Brown's contributions, though significant, were often overshadowed. He was, however, a key strategist and a tireless worker behind the scenes, helping to organize lectures, fundraisers, and resistance efforts. Brown's deep understanding of the plight of the enslaved, coupled with his experience on the ground level of the Underground Railroad, made him an irreplaceable figure in the fight for liberation. The abolitionist movement during the 1830s and 1840s was marked by a tremendous sense of urgency, as both public and private forces escalated in their opposition to freedom for Black Americans. Brown's role was not just as a facilitator of escapes, but also as a voice calling for the immediate end of slavery. This was a time of rising tension between the North and South, as the debate over the expansion of slavery into the Western territories became more heated. Brown, like many abolitionists, saw the fight as not just a moral issue, but a political one. His writings and speeches during this period grew increasingly radical. He called for the immediate emancipation of enslaved people and denounced the gradual, half-hearted measures proposed by some abolitionists who sought to avoid directly challenging the economic system that supported slavery. Yet, as much as Brown worked alongside others in the abolitionist cause, his personal journey was complicated by the reality that not all abolitionists agreed on the best way to achieve freedom. Brown's perspective on abolition was shaped by his own experiences with violence and systemic racism. He did not believe that gradual emancipation, which some Northern abolitionists advocated, was enough. In his eyes, slavery was a moral abomination, a system that needed to be destroyed in its entirety, and that could only be achieved through direct, forceful action. His passionate rhetoric reflected this belief. For Brown, the fate of enslaved people was not just a matter of politics, it was an urgent, life-or-death struggle. In the years that followed, Brown's role in the abolition movement deepened. He became a frequent speaker at abolitionist rallies and public meetings, his voice calling out for justice and equality for Black people. Brown's speeches were charged with a palpable sense of urgency and emotion. He described, in vivid detail, the horrors of slavery, the brutal whippings, the separation of families, the constant fear of being sold away. His words resonated deeply with his audiences, who were often moved to action by his first-hand accounts of the suffering of the enslaved. In particular, Brown's emphasis on the psychological and emotional toll that slavery took on enslaved people became a hallmark of his speaking style. In the face of mounting opposition, Brown's efforts continued undeterred. Southern states, with their economies deeply rooted in slavery, responded to the rising tide of abolitionism with increasing hostility. Brown's writings, especially Clotel, were banned in many Southern states. His efforts were vilified, his name smeared, and his work censored. In the North, while many abolitionists rallied behind him, there were still those who sought to moderate the movement, pushing for a less confrontational approach. Brown's uncompromising stance on immediate emancipation put him at odds with some of his fellow abolitionists, yet he remained steadfast in his commitment. The political climate in the United States during this period was increasingly polarized. The Dred Scott decision of 1857, which declared that African Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no authority to regulate slavery in the territories, further ignited the fires of discontent in the abolitionist camp. This was a decisive moment for Brown, who saw the ruling as a direct attack on the very notion of human freedom and equality. As political tensions rose, so too did the call for more radical action. Brown, by now a seasoned activist and a symbol of the fight for emancipation, remained a vocal advocate for immediate and uncompromising abolition. While Brown was deeply involved in the abolitionist movement, he did not limit his activism to speeches and writings alone. He also became a staunch advocate for women's rights and the equality of all oppressed people. He recognized that the struggle for Black liberation was intimately connected to the broader fight for human rights. His advocacy for women's rights, particularly the right to vote, added another dimension to his activism. This intersectional approach to social justice distinguished him from some of his contemporaries, who often viewed abolition and women's rights as separate struggles. For Brown, freedom was not just about the abolition of slavery, it was about the dismantling of all systems of oppression, whether they be based on race, gender, or class. Through his continued work on the Underground Railroad, his speeches, and his writings, Brown's role in the abolitionist movement became increasingly significant. His life was dedicated to the belief that slavery could not be reformed or ignored, it had to be eradicated. For him, there was no compromise, no middle ground. His involvement in the Underground Railroad, his radical abolitionist stance, and his personal sacrifice were all part of the same unyielding drive for justice. Yet, despite his tireless efforts, Brown's name and legacy would later face the same erasure that plagued many of his fellow abolitionists. His contributions would be downplayed or obscured by history. In his lifetime, Brown's role in the abolitionist movement was critical. Yet, as time passed, his contributions would slowly fade from mainstream memory. His works, though foundational to the abolitionist cause, were relegated to the margins of history, overshadowed by the more widely recognized figures in the movement. Even as Brown's involvement in the Underground Railroad and his role as a public advocate for freedom were pivotal to the success of the abolitionist movement, history's tendency to erase the names and stories of black activists meant that his impact was often overlooked. Nevertheless, for those who truly understood the significance of his work, William Wells Brown's role in the abolition of slavery and the fight for freedom remained an enduring symbol of courage, perseverance, and unwavering conviction. As William Wells Brown's voice grew louder in the fight against slavery, so did the reaction from those who sought to preserve the institution. In the South, the political landscape was deeply entrenched in the system of slavery. The very foundation of Southern economies, social structures, and cultural identities rested on the subjugation of black people. To challenge this system was not just to attack an economic institution, but to threaten the entire way of life that had existed for centuries. Brown, as one of the most vocal and influential figures in the abolitionist movement, quickly became a target. His writings, his speeches, and his very existence as a free black man who had once been enslaved, served as a reminder of the system's inherent injustice and, to many, its illegitimacy. In the early days of his activism, Brown's work had a wide-reaching impact, especially in the North, where many abolitionists were eager to end slavery and push for emancipation. However, as Brown's name spread beyond abolitionist circles, it soon became clear that the South would not easily accept the challenges to its social and economic order. The reactions to Brown's rise as a literary and political figure were swift and harsh. His work, particularly Clotel, was banned in Southern states. The novel's portrayal of the intimate lives of enslaved people, especially the plight of mixed-race individuals and the exploitation of black women by their white slaveholders, struck at the heart of the South's moral contradictions. The Southern backlash to Brown's work was rooted not only in the explicit content of his writings, but also in the broader political threat his activism posed. Brown's ideas challenged the very justification of slavery itself. In the South, where the economy was largely dependent on enslaved labor, any critique of slavery was seen as an existential threat. Brown's first-hand accounts of the horrors of slavery, told through his own personal experiences and those of others, served to expose the lies upon which the institution rested. This, in turn, galvanized Southern leaders to double down on their defense of slavery, leading to increasingly hostile rhetoric and actions. As the abolitionist movement gained momentum, so too did the violence and intimidation directed at those who advocated for its cause. Brown, as a black man, was particularly vulnerable to the pervasive racism that permeated the entire nation, but especially the South. His visibility as a former slave who had become a leading figure in the movement made him a prime target for those who sought to silence him. There were constant threats to his safety, particularly when he would give speeches or publish new works. White supremacist groups and Southern lawmakers used their power to intimidate and silence voices like his. The more he spoke out, the more vicious the retaliation became. One of the most significant forms of backlash came in the form of the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This law required that escaped slaves be returned to their owners, even if they had reached free states in the North. It was a direct challenge to the efforts of abolitionists like Brown, who were working to help enslaved people escape to freedom. The law created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion in northern states, as black people, whether free or enslaved, were vulnerable to being captured and sent back to the South. Brown, who had once escaped through the Underground Railroad, knew the risks all too well. The threat of being dragged back into slavery, even after gaining freedom, loomed over the heads of every abolitionist, and Brown's prominence only made him a bigger target for Southern interests. In the face of this escalating hostility, Brown's role within the abolitionist movement became more crucial. His activism was now not only about writing and lecturing, it was about survival. Every speech he gave, every book he published, every effort to help another individual escape slavery brought him into direct confrontation with the very forces he was fighting against. It wasn't just a matter of political disagreement, for Brown, it was a matter of life and death. The constant threat of violence and retaliation from Southern slaveholders and pro-slavery sympathizers became a permanent feature of his existence. Yet, despite the looming danger, Brown did not retreat. His voice remained steadfast, and his commitment to ending slavery never wavered. At the same time, the racial hostility he faced was not limited to the South alone. In many ways, the North, while more tolerant than the South, still maintained deep-seated prejudices against black people. Northern abolitionists often viewed Brown as an extraordinary example of perseverance, but many still struggled with accepting full equality for black people. Even in the so-called free states, the idea of full black citizenship and civil rights was a contentious issue. Brown, while lauded for his writings and activism, was still often seen through the lens of his race. His efforts to elevate the status of black Americans were frequently met with resistance from those who did not fully embrace the idea of racial equality. This racial tension manifested in subtle ways. For instance, while Brown had access to abolitionist circles, he often found himself relegated to the background when it came to the leadership of the movement. Many of the key figures in the abolitionist cause were white, and though they supported the end of slavery, their commitment to racial equality was often less fervent. Brown was keenly aware of the limits placed on him by his race. Despite his accomplishments, despite his courage, he was not always given the same respect as his white counterparts. His desire for full equality was sometimes at odds with a broader abolitionist movement that, while anti-slavery, did not always support the idea of full racial integration. The hostile political environment in the South also fueled a sense of urgency within the abolitionist movement. The country was heading toward an inevitable confrontation. The debate over slavery's expansion into the territories had reached a fever pitch, and the South was adamant that it would protect its peculiar institution at all costs. Brown, aware of the escalating tensions, increasingly saw the abolitionist struggle as part of a broader battle for the soul of the nation. The division between North and South, between free states and slave states, was becoming more pronounced, and the political future of the country seemed to hinge on the issue of slavery. As the 1850s progressed, Brown continued to speak out against the institution of slavery, despite the growing risks to his safety. His writings, including his speeches and the book Clotel, remained bold critiques of both the institution of slavery and the broader social and political system that upheld it. Yet, the South's backlash was not solely based on ideological differences, it was also fueled by a deep-seated racial animosity that saw any challenge to slavery as a challenge to the racial order. To many Southerners, the very idea of black people gaining freedom, education, and equality was a direct threat to their power and way of life. The political environment in the United States was increasingly charged, with slavery at the center of the debate. Brown was no longer just a writer or an activist, he was now a symbol of resistance. His identity as a free black man who had once been enslaved made him a living testament to the failure of slavery and the moral bankruptcy of the system. As the nation moved closer to the Civil War, Brown's efforts to educate and mobilize people against slavery became even more critical. Yet, despite the growing number of supporters in the North, the Southern backlash remained intense, and Brown's legacy would eventually be overshadowed by the ongoing political and racial hostilities that defined this tumultuous period in American history. In this climate of political and racial hostility, Brown's work remained both a challenge to the status quo and a beacon of hope for those struggling under the weight of slavery. Yet, as time went on, it became clear that the struggle for freedom and equality was far from over. Brown, like many abolitionists, would have to face not only the overt threats of violence from pro-slavery factions but also the more subtle, systemic forms of racial oppression that permeated every level of American society. Despite these challenges, Brown's voice endured, an enduring testament to the power of resistance in the face of overwhelming adversity. As William Wells Brown navigated the complexities of his newfound freedom, he was not merely fighting an external system of oppression, he was also wrestling with internal, psychological struggles that came from being a man torn between two worlds. Born into slavery, his life had been defined by the brutal realities of forced labor, dehumanization, and the constant threat of violence. Yet, as he gained his freedom, Brown found himself caught in a different kind of conflict, one that had to do with identity, race, and the question of belonging. His personal journey through this struggle, of defining himself in the face of both systemic oppression and internalized prejudice, was not unique, but it was profoundly significant, shaping not only his activism but also the very narrative of his life. Though Brown had escaped slavery and achieved a certain degree of freedom, he was acutely aware of the limitations placed on black people in post-slavery America. Freedom, for Brown, did not equate to full equality. While he had physically broken the chains that bound him, his freedom was constantly constrained by the unyielding racial boundaries of the time. In the North, where slavery was illegal, Brown was free from the immediate threats of captivity and forced labor. Yet the pervasive influence of white supremacy was felt everywhere, from the segregated communities to the racial discrimination that permeated both the private and public spheres. For Brown, freedom did not mean liberation from all forms of oppression. The external barriers, discrimination, violence, and the denial of full civil rights, were compounded by internal struggles that made his path to true self-actualization more complicated. As a former slave, Brown's journey toward defining his identity was shaped by his early experiences of racialization and subjugation. The psychological toll of slavery had left deep scars on his sense of self. Raised in a world where blackness was associated with inferiority, where he was seen as property rather than a human being, Brown's early conceptions of himself were fraught with conflict. He had been taught, through the oppressive institution of slavery, that he was less than human, that his worth was measured solely by his ability to serve others and produce labor. Even after gaining his freedom, the internalized racism and shame that had been instilled in him over the years continued to cast a long shadow. Yet, Brown's remarkable intelligence, his desire for knowledge, and his eventual success as a writer gave him the tools to challenge and transcend these feelings of inferiority. He became aware of his own worth and his capacity to contribute meaningfully to the world around him. As he began to understand the power of language and storytelling, he recognized that reclaiming his own narrative would be central to his personal growth. Writing became not only a way for him to process his experiences but also a means to assert his humanity, his identity, and his voice in a society that continually sought to silence him. However, this struggle for identity was not just internal, it was also external. As Brown's political and intellectual influence grew, he found himself confronting not only white supremacy but also the complexities of race within the black community itself. Though he was admired by many in the abolitionist movement, especially for his first-hand accounts of the horrors of slavery, there were times when Brown felt distanced from other black people. In the North, where free black communities were emerging, tension sometimes arose between those who had been born free and those like Brown, who had escaped from slavery. These divisions were often centered around issues of education, class, and, most notably, respectability. Brown's early life, marked by his slavery and the trauma that came with it, was a constant source of tension, as many free blacks, who had not experienced the same level of suffering, looked down on former slaves. This division within the black community was particularly challenging for Brown, as it forced him to reconcile the pain and resilience of his past with his desire to be accepted in more respectable circles. Though he was a published author and a well-known figure in the abolitionist movement, he was still often viewed through the lens of his former enslavement. In the eyes of some, his rough past and lack of formal education marked him as inferior, even within the ranks of those who fought for emancipation and equality. This tension exacerbated the internal struggle that Brown faced, as he sought to prove his worth not just to white America but also to a black community that sometimes saw him as too radical, too outspoken, or too tainted by his past. The struggle for respectability was compounded by Brown's awareness of his own racialized identity. As an African American man, Brown could never fully escape the societal expectations of blackness that were imposed upon him. These expectations often ran counter to his personal experiences and desires. He was expected to embody a kind of dignity and decorum that was aligned with the ideals of middle-class respectability, yet his life, marked by the brutal realities of slavery and the raw emotion of his writing, did not fit neatly into that mold. Brown had to constantly navigate the tension between these external expectations and his own lived reality, which often made him feel torn between competing identities. At the same time, Brown's racial identity was also inextricably linked to his role as an activist. As he became more involved in the abolitionist movement, he realized that his identity was not just personal, it was political. His story, as a former slave who had escaped to freedom, became a powerful symbol for the abolitionist cause. Yet, this visibility brought with it its own set of challenges. Brown found himself increasingly pressured to embody the ideals of the abolitionist movement, representing the struggle for freedom and equality not only as a writer and speaker but also as a black man whose very existence was a direct challenge to the status quo. Despite the deep internal struggles, Brown's resilience in defining himself on his own terms made him one of the most important and influential voices of his time. His works, particularly Clotel, became a testament to his ability to navigate these complexities. In Clotel, he presented not just a fictionalized account of slavery but a sharp critique of the way society constructed racial and gender identities. The novel's depiction of mixed-race people, particularly the complex character of Clotel, highlighted the arbitrary and oppressive nature of racial boundaries. In writing about characters who were both of African descent and the product of white slaveholders, Brown called attention to the contradictions within the institution of slavery and challenged the idea that racial identity could be so easily defined. Moreover, Brown's personal struggles with identity also extended into his larger understanding of freedom. As a man who had experienced the brutal violence of slavery and who had once been shackled by the economic and social structures of oppression, Brown viewed freedom not just as a physical condition but as a psychological and emotional state. His fight for freedom was as much about reclaiming his own sense of self-worth as it was about fighting for the liberation of others. In many ways, his activism was a means of finding a way to heal from the trauma of slavery, while also working to prevent others from experiencing the same fate. Yet, despite his public success and recognition, Brown's personal journey toward self-acceptance and peace was never fully realized. The scars of his past, both internal and external, remained with him throughout his life. In his later years, as the abolitionist movement began to reach its climax with the Civil War, Brown increasingly turned inward, seeking solace in his family and his personal reflections on the meaning of freedom. He had seen firsthand the ways in which systemic racism and slavery had dehumanized him, and while he had fought tirelessly to end these systems, the emotional and psychological weight of his experiences was not something that could easily be overcome. He never fully escaped the feeling of being caught between two worlds, one that had enslaved him, and another that, while free, was still shackled by prejudice and inequality. William Wells Brown's struggle for identity, his search for meaning and belonging, was emblematic of the broader fight for black freedom in America. He fought not only to dismantle the system of slavery but also to carve out a space where black people could define themselves, their futures, and their roles in society. In doing so, Brown's life became a powerful statement about the importance of self-determination, the right to shape one's own destiny, and the necessity of continuing the fight for equality in all its forms. His ability to assert his own humanity in the face of overwhelming odds became a guiding force for future generations, a reminder that the struggle for identity and freedom is both personal and collective, and that true freedom is found not just in the absence of chains, but in the ability to define oneself on one's own terms. William Wells Brown's life and work exemplified the profound power of words to spark change, shift ideologies, and challenge systems of oppression. From his early days as an enslaved person to his rise as a key figure in the abolitionist movement, Brown understood the potential of language to shape not only personal identity but also the course of history. His contributions to the abolitionist cause were not limited to his own life story, but extended to his writing, his speeches, and the enduring influence he had on the intellectual foundations of the fight for black freedom. Brown's words were more than just tools of personal expression, they were weapons in the battle against the institution of slavery and the racial injustices that permeated American society. Brown's first and most personal work, Narrative of William Wells Brown, was an intimate and visceral account of his experiences as an enslaved man, his escape to freedom, and the atrocities he witnessed. In this narrative, Brown offered a candid and harrowing glimpse into the realities of slavery. His ability to describe, with stark clarity, the brutality of the system, from the constant threat of physical violence to the emotional torment of family separation, made his work a powerful tool for abolitionists. It was not just a personal testimony, it was a universal condemnation of the institution of slavery. Brown's use of vivid imagery and his unflinching honesty forced his readers to confront the undeniable horror of slavery in a way that was both intimate and unignorable. This first work helped solidify Brown as a key figure in the abolitionist movement and served as an essential resource for those who were attempting to garner support for the abolition of slavery. What made Brown's narrative particularly compelling was its emotional weight and its ability to make his readers empathize with his plight. He did not simply present slavery as a political or economic institution, he made it a deeply human issue. The people within his narrative were not abstract victims, they were flesh and blood, mothers and fathers, children and siblings, each with their own hopes, dreams, and fears. Brown's depiction of their suffering transformed the abstract idea of slavery into a tangible, heartbreaking reality that could not be easily dismissed or ignored. His work became an essential piece of abolitionist literature because it reminded readers that slavery was not merely a policy or a legal institution, it was a dehumanizing force that had real, devastating consequences on people's lives. As Brown's role in the abolitionist movement expanded, so too did his literary influence. He went on to write Clotel, the first novel ever published by an African American, a daring exploration of race, identity, and the intersections between slavery and power. Clotel was not just a work of fiction, it was a deeply political statement. By telling the story of Clotel, the daughter of Thomas Jefferson and an enslaved woman, Brown challenged the very foundations of American society. The novel forced readers to confront the hypocrisy inherent in a nation that claimed to stand for liberty and justice, yet allowed for the systemic exploitation of black people. Through the character of Clotel, who was the product of a union between a white man and a black woman, Brown exposed the contradictions in the American narrative of racial superiority and the moral justification of slavery. At the heart of Clotel was a bold critique of race and the social constructs that supported slavery. Brown's portrayal of the mixed-race children of slaveholders highlighted the uncomfortable truth that slavery was not just a matter of black and white, it was about power, privilege, and the exploitation of vulnerable bodies. By shining a light on the lives of these children, who, despite their white ancestry, were treated as chattel, Brown exposed the arbitrary and brutal nature of the racial hierarchy. He pointed out that, for all the proclamations of equality and freedom that defined the American Revolution, there was an inherent contradiction in a system that permitted the enslavement of people based on the color of their skin. Yet, Clotel was more than just a critique of slavery, it was also a critique of the society that allowed it to persist. Through the story of Clotel and other characters, Brown questioned the ways in which race and gender intersected to create unique forms of exploitation. Brown's writing made it clear that the experience of being enslaved was not monolithic, it varied according to factors such as race, gender, and social status. Enslaved women, in particular, faced a unique set of challenges that compounded the general horrors of slavery. They were subject not only to the physical violence of the system but also to the sexual exploitation that came with being the property of their white masters. Brown's depiction of these abuses, often hidden or overlooked in other abolitionist literature, gave a voice to the women who had suffered in silence. In addition to Clotel, Brown's writings and speeches were integral to the shaping of abolitionist thought. While many abolitionists focused on the moral wrongs of slavery, Brown also approached the issue through a lens of practical, political action. He did not shy away from calling for immediate emancipation and urging the nation to confront the reality of racial inequality. His speeches were often charged with a sense of urgency and moral righteousness. He argued that the fight for freedom was not just about dismantling an economic system, it was about challenging the deeply ingrained racial prejudices that permeated every facet of American society. In his speeches, Brown emphasized that freedom for black people was not just a matter of law, it was a matter of human dignity. One of Brown's most significant contributions to abolitionist thought was his ability to frame the fight for freedom as a struggle not just for the black population but for all of America. He did not view the abolition of slavery as a separate cause, he saw it as a fundamental issue that affected the very moral foundation of the nation. Brown's work extended beyond calls for emancipation, it was a call for a more just and equitable society, one in which black people could enjoy the same freedoms and rights as their white counterparts. He believed that the success of the abolitionist movement was tied to the success of the entire nation, and that true freedom could only be achieved through the dismantling of all systems of oppression. Through his extensive writing, Brown contributed to a growing body of abolitionist literature that helped shape public opinion in the North and abroad. His narrative of personal struggle and his critiques of American society resonated with a wide range of audiences, from Northern intellectuals to ordinary citizens who were beginning to question the institution of slavery. Brown's works not only provided essential documentation of the horrors of slavery but also encouraged a new way of thinking about race, identity, and the nation's moral obligation to end the institution. His influence was not just academic, it was deeply political, serving as a rallying cry for the abolitionist movement and an inspiration for future generations of activists. Despite his significant literary contributions, Brown's name and legacy would face a gradual erasure in the years following his death. Like many other black abolitionists, his work was often overshadowed by more prominent figures in the movement. His writings were relegated to the margins of history, eclipsed by the fame of figures like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and others whose work had a wider readership. However, in the 20th and 21st centuries, scholars and historians have begun to rediscover Brown's legacy, recognizing him as one of the most important voices in the abolitionist movement. In many ways, William Wells Brown's impact on abolitionist thought can be seen in the way his work helped to shape the national conversation around slavery and racial justice. Through his writing, he pushed the boundaries of what was possible in terms of political discourse, challenging not just the institution of slavery but the very foundations of American society. He used his words to expose the contradictions and hypocrisies that defined the nation's approach to race and slavery, and in doing so, he left an indelible mark on the history of the United States. For Brown, the power of words was not just about conveying personal experiences, it was about inspiring others to take action, to see the world differently, and to fight for a future in which all people could be free from the bonds of slavery and racial oppression. His words were a form of resistance, a challenge to the status quo, and a call to arms for those who would join him in the fight for a more just world. And while his name may have been forgotten by many for a time, his work continues to resonate, a testament to the enduring power of the written word in the fight for freedom and justice. William Wells Brown's political engagement was inseparable from his identity as a former slave who became a leading voice in the abolitionist movement. While his personal journey from slavery to freedom had shaped much of his activism, Brown understood that the struggle for the abolition of slavery was not merely a moral issue, it was also a deeply political one. He saw that to dismantle slavery in America, it would not be enough to convince individuals of its inherent cruelty, the entire political and economic system that supported it had to be challenged. Thus, Brown's political influence was marked by his ability to use both his personal story and his intellectual prowess to bring about a broader social and political transformation. In the early years of his involvement in abolitionism, Brown recognized the importance of establishing political connections with prominent abolitionist leaders and reformers. His personal experience as a former slave gave him a unique position to argue against the institution of slavery in a way that was difficult for others to dismiss. His writings, including his narrative of William Wells Brown and Clotel, became essential documents in the abolitionist canon, offering a first-hand account of the horrors of slavery that helped shift public opinion. But while these personal accounts were powerful, Brown also knew that achieving meaningful change required political strategy, legislative action, and an understanding of how to mobilize a movement. One of the key ways that Brown wielded his political influence was through his speeches. He was an eloquent orator, and his public speaking engagements often brought him into direct contact with leading figures in the abolitionist movement, including Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and William Lloyd Garrison. Through his speeches, Brown sought not just to educate the public about the realities of slavery, but to mobilize them to take concrete political action. He spoke passionately about the necessity of immediate emancipation, rejecting the idea that slavery could be abolished gradually. For Brown, the political fight was not just about the moral issue of slavery, but about ensuring that Black Americans were granted the full rights of citizenship and equality. In many ways, Brown's political stance was radical for his time. While other abolitionists, particularly those in the more moderate camp, called for gradual emancipation or colonization, suggesting that freed slaves be sent to Africa or another part of the world, Brown rejected these ideas. He argued that the fight for freedom had to be immediate and uncompromising. His politics were shaped by a fundamental belief that slavery was not just a moral evil, but a direct threat to the very foundations of American democracy. Brown's calls for immediate abolition were grounded in his deep understanding of the systemic nature of slavery and the ways in which it was interwoven with the political, economic, and social structures of the nation. He knew that as long as slavery existed, the promise of liberty and equality would remain hollow. Brown's involvement in the political arena extended beyond the abolitionist movement. He also aligned himself with other reform causes, such as the fight for women's rights and the push for civil rights for all people, regardless of race or gender. He saw these movements as interconnected and believed that the struggle for the rights of enslaved people could not be separated from the broader struggle for human rights. His advocacy for women's rights, in particular, was groundbreaking. He was one of the few male abolitionists who vocally supported women's suffrage, understanding that the liberation of Black people was intrinsically tied to the liberation of women. Brown's commitment to equality extended beyond race. It was a commitment to dismantling all systems of oppression, whether they were based on gender, race, or class. As the political climate in the United States grew more polarized in the 1850s and 1860s, Brown's political influence only grew. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which required the return of escaped slaves to their owners, was a direct challenge to the abolitionist cause. It also served as a catalyst for further action within the movement. Brown was outspoken in his condemnation of the law, seeing it as a blatant violation of both human rights and the principles of liberty upon which the United States was founded. He argued that the law was not just a threat to enslaved people, but to all people who believed in the sanctity of freedom. His public opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act helped galvanize abolitionists, further solidifying his place as one of the movement's key political voices. At the same time, Brown's political activism extended beyond speeches and public writings. He also sought to influence the political landscape by working with established abolitionist organizations. He was a member of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, and his involvement in this group allowed him to collaborate with other leaders in the abolitionist movement to strategize and push for legislative change. While Brown's focus was on the immediate abolition of slavery, he also recognized that achieving this goal required building broad coalitions and advocating for legal reforms. His political savvy allowed him to work within these organizations to amplify his voice and ensure that his ideas reached a wider audience. In the lead-up to the Civil War, Brown's political role became even more critical. As the country became increasingly divided over the issue of slavery, Brown's public presence and unwavering stance on immediate emancipation were crucial in keeping the abolitionist cause at the forefront of national discourse. He used his platform to speak out against the Compromise of 1850, the Dred Scott decision, and other legal measures that were designed to protect the institution of slavery. His political activism was fueled by his understanding that the fight for slavery's abolition was not just about ending a cruel system, but about creating a nation in which black people could live with dignity and equality. Despite his contributions to the political struggle for abolition, Brown's legacy as a political figure has often been overshadowed by the more famous names of the abolitionist movement. Figures like Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and John Brown have been lauded for their roles in the fight to end slavery, but Brown's contributions were no less significant. His ability to mobilize people through his speeches and writings, his involvement in abolitionist organizations, and his tireless advocacy for immediate emancipation all made him an essential figure in the political landscape of the 19th century. Brown's commitment to the cause of abolition, and his insistence on the need for radical change, set him apart from many of his contemporaries. In retrospect, Brown's political influence can be seen as a precursor to the more radical political movements that would emerge in the 20th century. His advocacy for immediate emancipation, his calls for black equality, and his belief in the interconnectedness of various social justice causes all laid the groundwork for later movements for civil rights and black liberation. His ideas about the need for immediate, uncompromising action in the face of systemic oppression were echoed in the work of figures like W. B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and Martin Luther King Jr. Brown's refusal to accept anything less than full freedom and equality for black Americans was a vision that would continue to resonate long after his death. Throughout his life, William Wells Brown's political impact was far-reaching. His involvement in the abolitionist movement and his radical political views helped shape the discourse around slavery and freedom in America. His speeches, his writings, and his activism not only contributed to the abolition of slavery but also laid the groundwork for future civil rights movements. In the end, Brown's political influence transcended his time, as his calls for freedom and equality became central to the broader struggle for justice in America. His legacy serves as a reminder of the power of words and political action in shaping the course of history, and of the enduring relevance of the abolitionist struggle in the fight for racial and social justice. The aftermath of William Wells Brown's activism and literary contributions was not only a matter of political change but also of personal consequence. Brown, like many abolitionists of his era, lived to witness the fruits of his labor in the form of the eventual abolition of slavery in the United States, yet his legacy would be clouded by the larger forces of historical erasure and collective forgetting. Although he made significant contributions to both the abolitionist movement and American literature, his name gradually faded from the national consciousness after his death. The political gains he worked so tirelessly for, particularly the end of slavery and the granting of rights to black Americans, remained in flux and incomplete for decades after the Civil War. And while Brown's own immediate impact was significant, the broader societal shift he hoped for would take much longer to manifest. For much of the 19th century, Brown was recognized as one of the most important figures in the abolitionist movement. His writings, speeches, and active participation in pushing for the end of slavery made him a key figure in the fight for black freedom. However, as the years wore on, his story became increasingly obscure. This erasure was not entirely coincidental. The American narrative surrounding slavery and emancipation, particularly in the post-Civil War era, was increasingly shaped by a handful of prominent figures whose stories were easier to digest by the broader public. Figures like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were immortalized, not just for their radical work in abolition, but for their ability to build the kind of iconic legacies that would continue to serve as models for future generations. In contrast, Brown's story remained more complex, his radical stance on immediate abolition and his political influence overshadowed by the rising tides of Reconstruction and the eventual disenfranchisement of black people in the post-war South. After the Civil War, the country found itself at a crossroads. The abolition of slavery was a significant achievement, but it was not the end of racial inequality or discrimination. The Reconstruction era, marked by efforts to integrate formerly enslaved people into the fabric of American society, was a brief period of hope that soon gave way to Jim Crow laws, disenfranchisement, and racial violence. For Brown, whose fight had always been centered around the ideals of equality, justice, and full citizenship, the failure to realize these goals after the Civil War must have been profoundly disheartening. Though he saw slavery legally abolished, he knew that the social, economic, and political systems that had upheld slavery were not so easily undone. In the years following the Civil War, Brown faced a shift in his own public reception. As an intellectual, activist, and writer, Brown's influence was still felt in the circles of abolitionism, but it was increasingly restricted to smaller, more radical segments of society. His work, particularly his novels and autobiographies, lost the wide readership they had enjoyed in the 1850s and 1860s. The Reconstruction era was, in many ways, a moment of ideological consolidation in the nation, where the radical visions of abolitionists and their more conservative counterparts became increasingly distanced. Figures like Brown, who advocated for immediate equality and full citizenship for black people, were marginalized in favor of those who focused on more gradual changes, or those whose narratives better fit the post-war ideals of national unity. The political victories that Brown had fought for, the abolition of slavery, the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, were significant, but they were not the end of the fight. By the late 19th century, the focus of public discourse shifted away from the radical demands of the abolitionist movement. The compromises made during Reconstruction, such as the withdrawal of federal troops from the South in 1877, and the abandonment of efforts to protect black civil rights, meant that for many black Americans, the post-war era was characterized more by regression than progress. This regression mirrored the broader societal tendency to downplay the radical demands of abolitionists like Brown, whose calls for immediate and total freedom for black Americans were not fully realized during his lifetime. Although Brown was not forgotten by all, he became an increasingly peripheral figure in the national story. The historical narrative began to focus more on the legal victories of the Civil War and less on the lived experiences of former slaves, or on the personal sacrifices of activists like Brown who had lived through the horrors of slavery and had fought tirelessly for the full integration of black people into American society. The myth of the happy slave began to take hold in some circles, undermining the urgent and radical testimonies of individuals like Brown, whose direct confrontations with the cruelty of the institution of slavery and its aftermath were seen as inconvenient or too uncomfortable to acknowledge. In Brown's personal life, the aftermath of his activism was more complex.